I think we'll kick off. I would like to welcome you all this morning to the GrassCheckGB conference. My name is Debbie McConnell, and I will be chairing this morning's session. So today's conference really marks the end of sort of the first 3 years and the first phase of the GrassCheckGB project, which started back in 2019. And today's really a good opportunity to share some of the results that we've had from the project over the last 3 years, and then talk a little bit about moving forward with the project over the next couple of years. The project itself, as I said, was set up back in 2019, really with the aim of sort of collecting sort of real life commercial farm data across GB to identify both the potential and actual grass production and grass utilisation rates across on farms across England, Scotland and Wales. And that's so vitally important given how crucial grass is to our industry and to our livestock farms here in England, Scotland and Wales. The conference itself, the project itself, it's funded by industry and it's done in conjunction. You can see the range of the partners there on the screen in front of you, and it really brings together industry, scientists and farmers, and it's all about really advancing grassland production and grass utilisation on livestock farms in GB, and doing that by firstly providing regular data, and I hope many of you are familiar with the GrassCheckGB bulletins, and generating tools and information that can help farmers really make the most of the valuable resource that we have. So today, really, the conference is split into 2 parts. The first part this morning, we'll hear some of the results of the project, some of the science work that's been done over the last 3 years. And then this afternoon we'll get to hear from some of the research that's been undertaken in the area of sort of grassland research from the academic partners involved in the project. That's Rothamsted Research and ourselves at AFBI. And so that'll give a flavour of some of the ongoing work that's obviously very much aligned and relevant to grassland farms across GB. So I suppose just to give you a quick view, this is our agenda for this morning's session. So we'll run right through to about 12 o'clock. We've got a range of speakers. So you can see from the screen there, we've got some of our project partners speaking this morning. We'll hear from Kat Houston, who's going to give us an overview of the GrassCheckGB data that's been collected over the last 3 years from those farms. And we've got some farms featuring as well, some of the GrassCheckGB farms, and be really good to hear how important grass is to their business and some of the decisions that they do use and take to make the most of that resource. By way of sort of housekeeping then this morning, we will, just to remind everybody that hopefully now that you've joined, everybody should be muted, and would ask you to stay in that as we go throughout the morning session. If you do want to ask any questions at any time for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A box, not the chat. Please use the chat box. It should come in there. I don't see the Q&A box available so please use the chat box and pop that in there to us, and that will that should come through, okay? And we'll then pick those up at the end of each speaker and pose that to the speaker. The webinar will be recorded and will be available after the event, and the link should be available from the GrassCheckGB website. And I know we can sometimes have some technical difficulties, so if you do have any problems, please just try leaving and rejoining the conference, and that usually fixes them. So without further ado, I think at this stage we'll hand over to our first speaker, who is Robert Hassell, who is going to talk to us this morning about really how and why to measure grass, because that's really the foundation of what we've been doing within the GrassCheckGB project. So Robert, at this stage, I'll pass over to you. Thanks very much.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Not yet, Robert.
Can you see it yet?
Nothing coming through yet.
Hang on, let's just go back. I should have done share. Now,
there we go. That's coming up.
Okay, we're away. Okay.
If you want to put it
Technology.
into the slideshow, yeah.
Yeah, will do.
Sure.
Technology is a great thing when it works.
Thanks,
Okay.
Robert.
Yeah, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. Kat sort of said 5 to 10 minutes. So, you know, talking about measuring, I can talk all day, as people know. But anyhow, so let's get on. The biggest secret to increase pasture harvest is to measure. And by measuring, you'll grow more and you'll utilize more. And really, at the end of the day, why do we measure? Measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. If you can't measure something, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you can't control it. If you can't control it, you can't improve it. And really, to be perfectly honest, that's what measurement's all about. It's actually benchmarking, and to be perfectly honest, from the day we're born, actually we start measuring because they weigh us and it goes on and on and on, and we measure our height and God knows what. But anyhow, that's life. So why do we measure grass? On a highly profitable grass-based farm, grazed grass will make up more than 80% of an animal's diet. Farmers regularly measure concentrate or silage allowances, but grass is sometimes overlooked. And in reality, grass, when used, can have a significant effect on the bottom line. Measuring grass is a great predictive management tool. To be perfectly honest, we're not interested in how much grass is in today's paddock, mainly because that is a result of last month's management. We're interested in how much grass is going to be on the farm in a week, 3 weeks' time, and beyond that, depending on the time of year. The farm needs to be set up to maximize intakes. So measuring gives you control by allowing you to plan, which includes feed intakes, your silage cuts, your fertilizer program, and of course it also links with financial budgeting. To target high profits from your farming operation, maximizing grass intakes, especially at the shoulders of the years, is essential. This can only be achieved by setting targets and monitoring progress against those targets. So in other words, we've all heard this saying before, if you don't measure, you cannot manage. And finally, you will make more money. So how do we go about measuring? Grass is measured in the terms of amount of dry matter per hectare. Ryegrass, clover, swards, and all other pastures, feedstuffs are measured in terms of dry matter. And this is because feeds have a variable water content, and all their nutritive value is contained in the dry part of the feed, which consists of coarse sugars, starches, and fiber. Therefore, we are only interested in dry matter content of any feed. And this can be a good example. This can be very low in the spring pasture. It might only be 12% dry matter. And in other words, to eat 12 kilograms of dry matter, the cow has to consume 100 kilograms of wet grass, which is actually a huge amount. So what are the methods of actually measuring? There's eyeballing. It has advantages. It's quick and easy. The disadvantages can be inaccurate if your eye is not properly in. Personally, I would only recommend that people using this measuring technique use it once their eye has been trained. And really, to be perfectly honest, you need to go back from time to time and just check to see that you are where you think you are. The alternative is a rising plate meter. It is also reasonably quick. It forces you to walk the farm, get your eye in. And the disadvantages of a rising plate meters, you have to beg, borrow, steal, or purchase one. Still probably the best way to learn about the measurement of grass. Cutting, drying, and weighing. Advantages, most scientifically accurate method, providing that your cutting technique is consistent. Disadvantages, only gives a reading in one small sample area. Relies on you, the person, picking a representative sample for the paddock, which is impossible, to be perfectly honest, as grass varies a lot across the field. To get a true representation, several samples need to be taken across the one field, which is time consuming. My personal view, not practical in the real world, when we need to get a rough idea of the cover for the whole farm. Another way to do it is working backwards from animal intakes, and probably the best for checking up on how well the plate meter is measuring. You know the animal numbers you've got, and then you can work out the demand. From that, you can work out what their intake is based on how long they graze for and the paddock size. And if, say, argument's sake, for the residual is 1,600 kilograms of dry matter or whatever, it is easy, very easy to work backwards and see how much grass must have been in the paddock when they first went in there. Other methods, there are drones, satellites, etc. being trialled, but in reality, I believe to get a true reflection of what has happened on the farm, pasture managers more than sitting in an office making pasture management decisions. In other words, seeing is believing. We do talk about ideal covers to go into, but more importantly, it is the residuals that are left after grazing that will have the greatest effect on grass production and quality over the season. So what do you include in your measurements? I mean, the main thing is to include all the grazing area that you actively manage. That is the milking platform, or if the whole farm is run as one unit, include the young stock grazing area as well. Anything which is only grazed once or twice a year, you know, silage areas or runoff areas, they should not be included in the average farm cover. Regularly measure farm cover, and ideally, if you're planning ahead, you should be setting up the autumn, in the autumn, the spring grass budgets and so on and so forth. So really this comes about measuring to plan. So that is one of the keys. And then really, before you take the cows off or the animals off the land, obtain a final measurement when stocks leave the grazing area. If you're aiming for early turnout, measure the no later than 1st of February. And if dairying, ideally before calving starts to obtain opening covers. Between February and the end of March, measure fortnightly. You know, some people do like to measure weekly, but I'm just doing it as a minimum. And if concerned or if growth situation is changing rapidly, increase frequency to at least once a week. Between May and mid-August, depending on the summer dry period, if growth is meeting demand, focus on pre and post grazing covers. Probably haven't got enough time to talk about post grazing covers today, but I believe that's one of the most important things. When there's a dry summer, dry matter percentage in the summer can be deceiving. So in other words, the percentage of dry matter can be a lot higher than expected, which will result in higher residuals. Therefore, actually rotation length will actually have to be changed or supplements added or whatever to maintain that pasture quality. Also use average covers to decide your rotation length and use this information to construct a supplement strategy if you need to feed supplements. So the ultimate aim of pasture measurement. We're aiming to get stock on top quality leafy grass with an ME content of 11.5 to 12 megajoules of energy per kilogram of dry matter and an NDF of 35 to 40% for as much of the year as possible. So really we're looking for top quality rye clover pasture, and it needs to be short and leafy, have a high proportion of leaf to stem, have no dead or rotten leaves at the bottom of the sward, have no dead white trash at the base. And if you've got white trash at the base, it indicates that the grass got too stemmy in the last rotation. So it's, you know, you need to get it back to quality. And you shouldn't be going into grazing covers any higher than 2,008 to 3,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Pasture utilization key points. Pasture quality. Implement a rotational grazing plan to maximize leafy stage of growth. Seek to a dense pasture sward to intercept as much sunlight as possible. Minimize sward damage caused by overgrazing or soil pugging or whatever. This can be achieved through strategic use of supplements and standing animals off pasture. Use grass silage as a supplement to ensure long-term pasture yields. And do put in place a program of pasture renewal, but based on analysis of the current yields versus potential yield. And once again, if you don't measure, you can't manage that either. Just keep in mind that newer species planted have much better growth potential. And for example, better winter cool seasonal growth, better leaf to stem area, and high digestibility. But, and here is the main big but, before reseeding, identify any issues such as drainage, compaction. Do take soil samples to ensure nutrients are not limiting pasture production. And tetraploids have largely replaced diploids as herds appear to graze these pastures more easily and tolerate higher pre-grazing covers. Improved pasture utilization has the greatest ability to underpin profit. Not utilizing homegrown feed equates to a waste of money. Pasture can be mowed pre-grazing to maintain quality or topped after grazing. Stocks are shifted as residual targets are met, and that goes back to my statement. I think residuals are the main thing that actually people should be concerned about. It is what is left in the pasture after grazing. Make use of programs like AgriNet and Kingswood to assist when making pasture management decisions. And of course, use electric fencing or whatever as and when required. So coming back to the GrassCheck project and the benefits to the UK, grass is not the easiest crop to manage, mainly because there are a lot of variables, but the work that has been done over the past few years by the GrassCheck project will, if used, and I do stress if used, will go a long way to assist farmers in making farm management decisions. The project has included weekly grass measurement using plate meters, soil temperature records, soil moisture records, and grass samples have been analysed. This has created a good base to work from to assist when making those management decisions. Historically, the UK has relied on data from Ireland and New Zealand, but the UK has its own climate and soil types. And the key is to use the data collected through the project to predict trends, which is important when making those day-to-day pasture management decisions. This will in turn increase farm profitability. So the key to success is a willing to rethink, how is your pasture managed? And if you always do it, you've always done, then you always get what you've always got. Use pasture measurements to identify inefficiencies and get help when needed. There are a lot of like-minded people out there that are prepared to discuss and assist. And people will talk all day about grass. Find like-minded people who are not victims of deep-rooted traditions. Measure and benchmark your business, and I think that's the key. So some of the key points: have a goal, but be flexible. Not all data or not all measurements taken within your business are going to be meaningful. Unless you know what you're trying to achieve, it is important to discard irrelevant data and use data as the most relevant to your farm business. You'll miss opportunities unless you use data to challenge orthodox thinking. So really, success is connected with action. Successful people will keep moving. And to be perfectly honest, when you're grazing grass and measuring and managing grass, you'll make mistakes, but be perfect. What I'd say is don't quit. And I'll go back to the first slide. Why measure? Measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. And if that's I think that is one take-home message from today. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Robert. And I suppose just really important, your final message there about obviously measurement and how crucial that is. I think that's something within grassland systems. When we have a cow in a house, it's very easy to measure lots of information about that house, but actually once we go into the variability of a grassland system, things get a little bit more difficult to measure, and that's why it is really important to do so, because things can change so rapidly. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Just a couple of questions, Robert. I suppose you've been involved with the GrassCheckGB project now for 3 years, and we've had a range of farms involved, some of which have got plenty of experience with measuring, were measuring before the project. Some started measuring once they came onto the project. I suppose for yourself, what's the biggest, or the one thing that really the biggest lesson I suppose to take from that, from working with those farms, particularly those people that are coming into measurement sort of early on? What are the biggest lessons, I think, to make sure that that measurement is a success and that it's used effectively on the farm?
And I think so I suppose the easiest way to look at that is it's through discussion. I mean, taking a load of measurements and actually sending them off to AgriNet and then actually not having the feedback or being able to interpret those measurements is not a great deal of help. So I think I would say actually one of the biggest stumbling blocks has been a little bit, do we say COVID? It's caused a little bit of an issue, whereas, I mean, initially we were going to be, or I was going to be getting out in farms and talking with farmers as well and discussing what they were doing with grass to give them better value out of the measurements they were taking. Hopefully, as time progresses, we will be able to do more of that over the coming year. Even if it's actually done remotely, I'm more than happy to sit here and look at people's figures and actually advise remotely, which I have done. So, you know, whatever would work to help.
Brilliant. And a question just that's come through, Robert, would you adjust your target dry matter if you're using non-ryegrass white clover pastures, such as herbal lays?
Sorry, just
so
repeat that so I understood.
Question which has come in is, would you adjust your target dry matter if you're using herbal lays?
Yes, of course. I mean, the easiest thing for a presentation like this today is just to talk about a ryegrass clover lay. And yes, of course, we would do. We would be talking to totally different figures, but that's sort of another story and another day, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for that, Robert. I think at this stage we'll move on to our next speaker. Now, unfortunately, we were hoping to have Matt House with us this morning from Who Farms in Dorset, one of our GrassCheck farms. Unfortunately, Matt's having some trouble joining us with the technology, so we're going to move on at this stage, and if we can get him back later in the programme, we'll try and do so. But we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Kat Hewson from AFB here in Northern Ireland. Kat's been the lead scientist on the project for the last sort of 3 years and has been working with the data week in, week out. So Kat's going to give us an overview of the GrassCheckGB project itself and some of the findings from the last 3 years. So Kat, over to you.
Thanks, Debbie. Can you see that screen come up okay?
Yes, no problem.
Excellent. Yeah, so I just wanted to give a quick overview to everybody this morning of some of the results and some of the project activity that we've had going on over the past 3 years. Just to give a brief introduction to anyone that's slightly less familiar with the project, GrassCheckGB began back in March 2019, and we established a network of 50 farms across GB to be involved in the monitoring activity. The project was developed off the back of the long-running GrassCheck programme, which has been operating in Northern Ireland for over 20 years now. And across GB, we were selecting farms to incorporate people running a range of different production systems, operating at different intensity levels and with different land types to really capture the diversity of British farms that are operating in grassland environments. And the only caveat being that they're all operating some kind of rotational grazing system within the group. The project involves research institutes, the red meat levy boards from England, Scotland and Wales, and a number of industry sponsors, and you can see these across the bottom of my slide, and we're really grateful for all of their support and being involved in the project. And really the key aims of GrassCheckGB were to try and provide a more detailed understanding of grass growth potential across Great Britain. So we know that only a small fraction of farmers at the moment routinely measure and record their pasture. And as Robert has alluded to, we really want to try and encourage that measure to manage approach to grassland management to really help people improve the efficiency and improve the productivity of their grassland systems. We also wanted to look at sort of the actual variability in terms of grass production and grass utilisation on farms across the country. And there is a grass growth prediction model that's been used in Northern Ireland for a number of years now to provide short-term grass growth forecasts through the season. And we wanted to take that model with some benchmarking data from GB and adapt that to suit the GB regions as well. And alongside all of the data on sort of grass quantity, we're looking at measuring grass quality every week through the season as well, and sharing that data to the public and to other farmers so that it can be used to inform those day-to-day grassland management decisions. Obviously, with that kind of monitoring, there's a lot of data that's coming into the project. So grass growth and grazing event data, that kind of thing is coming in through AgriNet to us. Grass quality samples are being sent off by farms every fortnight, and that's on an alternating schedule. So we get samples every week through the season. supported by Scientech, who are doing the analysis on those. And then each farm in the GB project has on-site an automated weather station that's providing us with a wealth of weather data localized to each farm, so we know exactly what the weather conditions are that are associated with the grass growth figures that they're putting in. In terms of looking back over the last 3 years, we've certainly had 3 very different grazing seasons. Weather has unsurprisingly been the key factor that sort of influenced the variability in these in these data sets and these grass growth curves. And actually we've seen the biggest variability so far in sort of spring conditions, much more consistency for the last 3 years, sort of later on in the autumn, grass growth being more consistent year to year than it has been earlier on. And I think the lessons learned from working with the GrassCheckGB farmers, and what they've really clearly demonstrated to us, is that successful management in grassland systems really requires that flexibility and adaptability to make changes as you're going through the season when things aren't maybe going the way you would have expected. We have not had typical grass growth curves so far, and everybody's had to react to that as we've been going through. And that's not to say that by doing this measuring and managing, the GrassCheckGB farmers can avoid the challenges of grassland management, not at all. But they've certainly demonstrated that you can weather the storm a bit better and make those proactive changes to just try and minimise the impact of those challenges if you're employing that measure and manage approach. When we look at those grass growth curves in terms of annual yields, we've seen big variability in those across the years, but also differences between each region, which is what we would expect given sort of the variability in weather conditions across the country and in different areas through the year as well. There's some figures on these graphs, but really what it's highlighting is that as a whole, the 50 farms involved in GrassCheckGB are routinely producing average yields above 8 tonne, 2019 being a particularly good grass growing year, and we saw average yields over 11 tonne of dry matter per hectare through that season. And the last 2 years, sort of 9.4, 9.5 as an average over the whole of the project. To put that into context, those figures for us have been really positive. So current data that would estimate sort of average levels of grass production across the industry and across the country would say maybe we're getting about 7.5 tonne dry matter per hectare per year from the average dairy farm, slightly less than 5 tonne from the average beef or sheep farm across Great Britain, which is sort of significantly behind what GrassCheckGB farmers are demonstrating is achievable with the rotational grazing systems that they're running. Looking back just at 2021, there were sort of 2 key factors that were influencing grass growth over the last 12 months. The first one being that exceptionally cold winter that ran well into spring, and cold conditions really holding back early grass growth, which rapidly shifted to a very, very dry April, preventing grass growth really taking off in the springtime until a little bit later. But then later on through the year, we actually saw quite consistently dry conditions developing on and off through the summer months, and that just holding down average summer growth rates for 2021 as well. This is sort of how the figures look when we look at yields from individual farms over the last year, and you can see there's a huge amount of variability from farm to farm because every farm is different, every farm has a different grass growth potential, and every system is working towards slightly different aims. But you can certainly see the impressive yields that have been achieved by GrassCheckGB farms. There's a couple of figures that are shaded out on this graph, and that's just for one reason or another. We maybe don't have a complete March to October grazing season's worth of data for that farm, so they're going to be lower figures than that farm has actually achieved as well. So I've mentioned soil moisture already. I feel like I mention soil moisture a lot when I'm talking about GrassCheckGB. It's not the only feature that will impact on grass growth rates through the season by a long way, but it has certainly been a feature for each of the last 3 years. So I just wanted to speak a little bit about the soil data that we're recording with those weather stations on GrassCheckGB farms. The Vantage Pro 2 weather stations that are on farm also have soil stations associated with them, and they're measuring soil temperature and soil moisture figures, and those probes are planted about 15 centimetres deep in the soil, so they're sitting around about where the majority of your grass roots are going to be. And we publish those figures as part of our weekly bulletins, depending on which is appropriate for the time of year. The soil moisture readings take a little bit of getting to grips with in terms of the way the scale works. So those sensors are essentially measuring soil moisture tension and how easy or otherwise it is for plant roots to take water up from the soil that they're planted in. And the scale for these sensors works from 0 to 200 with a centibar value, with sort of 0 to 10 being completely saturated soil. You'd be getting a reading of 0 if you put the probe in a bucket, running up to 200 being absolutely bone dry. But the key sort of values within that scale that we would be using in the project is sort of indications from the manufacturers, but also from the data that we've had coming in from GrassCheckGB farms, is that when you hit a soil moisture value of around about 60, or getting up above that, that's when you might start to see soil moisture deficit having a detrimental impact on grass growth through the sort of drier period of the summer. And we've seen that threshold being breached quite a few times over the past few years, and actually seeing average soil moisture values even up over and above 150 centibars for certain weeks through the seasons as well. So just to try and illustrate that relationship a bit more clearly for everybody, I've overlaid here the grass growth curves from the last 3 years, which are in green, with the soil moisture values that are coming in as an average across the whole of GB. And there is farm to farm variation depending on soil types, and there's regional variation in those figures as well. But just as an overall average, this is the picture we've seen for the last 3 years. And I've highlighted in red the more significant periods of dry weather that we've recorded and dry soil conditions that have been associated with that. The dashed orange line here is sort of showing that 60 centibar threshold for dry soil conditions. And you can see we saw a couple of little peaks in 2019, but nothing overly dramatic and nothing that had a major impact on grass growth that year, perhaps. 2020 was a different story with some incredibly dry conditions. That's where we hit that 150 centibar peak for dry conditions in the summertime, and really seeing a significant drop in the grass growth rate during that period as well. 2021, there's the smaller peak there in April where we got those very dry conditions. You can see as soon as that blue line began to drop, because rain arrived, grass growth really picked up very rapidly. But then through the season, later on in the summer, soil moisture just sort of quite frequently being up in that dry condition that we've seen impacting on grass growth rates as well. Another figure that is quite important when we're talking about grassland management, and Robert has mentioned this earlier as well, is utilisation. It's all very well being able to grow lots of grass, but the really important thing is to consider, are you using it, and are you using it as well as possible? So the grass utilisation figures that we're taking from GrassCheckGB farms, we're calculating them from the pre and post grazing covers that are recorded by the farmers through AgriNet every time they're recording a grazing event for their paddocks. The standard target that we're using as a project is a post-grazing residual of 1,500 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Obviously, that target will vary for individual farms depending on their stock, sort of the stocking type. So, for example, higher yielding dairy cows, probably not going to want to push them quite that hard to achieve 1,500, whereas if you've got sheep, certain times it might be actually the challenge is making sure you take them out early enough, because they'll graze much shorter than that if you want them to. And what we've seen over the past 3 years is really exceptional figures in terms of grass utilisation from the grazing systems on GrassCheckGB farms. So the average overall from 2019 was 78.2% utilisation, and that's risen to just over 80 and approaching 81% over the past 2 years. There is a wide variation in those figures. As I said, so the key consideration with looking at utilisation is considering your own system and your own targets, because it will vary between farms. The graph there is just showing average utilisation for individual GrassCheckGB farms over the past 3 years, and you can see there's a range between farms, but they tend to be reasonably consistent between the 3 years that are on the graph. One thing to mention, a couple of the farms that are having perhaps lower utilisation figures here, we do have some challenges in terms of recording utilisation on farms that have leader-follower systems. So we'll have the records for the main group of stock going in and coming out, but if farmers are then putting in a group of dry cows or they're following with ewes behind lambs to tidy up paddocks, that's a really good way of achieving good levels of utilisation. It's just slightly more difficult for us to record the figures. And obviously it's not all about quantity. Grass quality is really important, and we wanted to monitor and hopefully try and drive sort of improvements in average grass quality as part of this project. So these graphs here are illustrating the variation we see in terms of weekly grass quality and the 4 key measurements that we're sort of recording and publishing every week. So dry matter, crude proteins, sugar and energy as a metabolizable energy value. And what we've seen is really very good levels of grass quality, and that is as a result of the very good sort of utilisation and attention to residuals and grassland management that's been going on in the background. That's really helping to boost grass quality samples that are coming in from these paddocks. We've seen, in terms of ME, grass quality has improved year on year over the past 3 years of the project, and in 2021 the average across the whole season was 11.7, so a really high quality feed source, and protein in just around 19.5%. So an excellent feed source for livestock, and something that, being the cheapest feed that's available to us, hopefully everybody really is trying to make the most of. Obviously there's variability, and part of it is linked to weather conditions as well, so there's not a lot of control that you can have over dry matter at certain times or any time of the year. But what we did see in 2021, and that has sort of helped with boosting those quality figures, is the sunny spell we had in the spring. Even though grass wasn't growing, quality was exceptional. We had 3 weeks in a row where average grass quality was 12.4 megajoules per kilogram dry matter, and I think a period of 6 weeks where the average from all farms was over 12. So just to kind of summarise from the large amount of data that's been collected over the past 3 years, these are some of the sort of key findings that are coming out, and obviously there's a lot of data and there's more that we're hoping to do with it as we go forward. But certainly GrassCheckGB farms have demonstrated they're routinely capable of growing sort of 8 to 12 tonne or more of grass dry matter per hectare over a season within a rotational grazing system. And that is despite some very challenging weather conditions on and off over the past 3 years. And that includes farms that are operating in more difficult topographies with a lower sort of grass growth potential than some of the others involved in the project. So really a focus on grassland management and on grazing covers has demonstrated that grass utilisation of sort of a very high level can be achieved, and we've seen average figures of over 80% for the past 2 seasons, which is phenomenal. And in terms of quality, grass is a consistently high quality feed, and it's underpinned by good management. So if you're managing your grass well, you're really going to get the best quality grazing possible, as well as making the most efficient use of it. Now, another key aim for this round of GrassCheckGB was to develop those grass growth prediction models that I mentioned at the beginning. Originally, the model, which is called Graze Grow, was developed back in 2005, so I can't take any credit for the development of this model at all. But it's been in use in Northern Ireland for a number of years now for the grass growth forecasting. And the inputs that we have going into the model, even though it's quite a complex model, the regular inputs that are needed are quite straightforward and relatively few, so it makes operating it on a weekly basis reasonably straightforward. The figures that we put into the model are a measure of photosynthetically active radiation. So that's essentially a measure of the energy and sunlight that's coming in that the plants can use for photosynthesis and for growth. The maximum and minimum air temperatures are recorded each day, and daily rainfall figures. When we set the models up at the start of the season as well, we're also including settings to account for the soil type or the drainage of the soils, initial density of the pastures, and we set it up with a set defoliation and fertilizer regime. So how often the paddocks are going to be cut or grazed through the year and how much nitrogen is going to be put on. So originally, the Graze Grow model was set up and it was optimized for grazing management rather than silage management, but it was linked to plots that were cut on a 21-day regime, and that's still how it's operated in Northern Ireland at the moment. The model can be used for longer defoliation periods, but we've been focusing on grazing systems at the moment, and it was set up to run for a March to October grazing season. And the original aim of the model was to use accessible weather information as the input data to facilitate the modelling of grass, sort of across temperate Europe, really. So it's been in use in Northern Ireland, but it has broader scope, and that's why we're hoping that it will be in use in GB very soon. Just to kind of give a bit of background on some of the wider benefits that have come out of the Graze Grow model and the GrassCheck projects. The monitoring activity that goes on provides really sound evidence and has been used in the past in Northern Ireland to support payments and support sort of informed policy around farming and around forage production. But the GrassCheck project as a whole, if you speak to farmers, is an invaluable resource for sort of supporting their short-term grassland management decisions through the season. And I sort of wanted to show you this slide with a question of why monitor and model grass growth. And you know, I've heard the argument that, you know, why do you need to be modelling grass growth, because we see what happens on the pastures. And I can understand that argument when we're getting typical grass growing season and you know what your grass growth curve is going to look like because it's been relatively similar for a number of years. But I think those times, certainly with the figures we've seen coming in from GrassCheckGB, are behind us. We've had 3 very different years, none of them being typical in terms of what you'd expect of grass growth at certain times. And then this example from grass growth conditions in 2018, when we had some very, very difficult dry summer conditions, is a great example. So on the left is the grass growth curve that we were recording from our plots in red. The blue dashed line is the typical grass growth curve for Northern Ireland at that point, and that was built from a 10-year average. And the red dots were the predictions that came out of the model. And then on the right, you can see the actual grass growth curve by the end of the season as to how that dip had transpired. And sort of speaking to farmers that had noted what was coming out of the predictions, but also noted what was going on with their own grazing wedge and grass on their own farm, they were able to make changes earlier, be that selling stock or not taking a silage harvest and leaving it standing forage, but make those changes that just made it slightly easier to get to the other side of that dip. The data coming in from the project was also used to support the early release of single farm payments and allow people to purchase extra forage in that year as well. So in terms of the grass growth model for GB and the progress that we've made with it, the current Northern Ireland model has been adapted, so it now covers a 365-day period. We can produce figures all year round, particularly if you're looking at extended grazing seasons, that's going to be useful to us. And it's also been adapted to suit the weekly measuring periods that the data comes in from the GrassCheckGB farm sales rather than that 3-week plot harvest model. Using the data from 2019 and 2020, we sort of optimised the settings within 4 different versions of the model to reflect what the conditions in each of the GB regions. And we've done this on a regional scale really to allow us to have enough on-farm weather and grass growth data to have a good average for a good comparison. The model is applicable at the farm level, but you do need some very detailed information for the farms and able to, in order to get that running accurately. We then ran the model as a test through 2021, and we shared the predictions with GrassCheckGB farmers through our WhatsApp groups. It wasn't perfect, but there's been a lot of work to refine it over the last couple of months as well. And I think hopefully we've got a much better version of the model than we did 12 months ago. One of the key things that I have been looking at over the past couple of months is the nitrogen fertilizer conditions in the model, and I've put that this is a supervised condition. I think it's something that we need to be aware of, and we need to maybe be changing through the season to reflect what's going on farms. That's certainly something that we saw in 2021, because in response to weather conditions experienced, people are going to be changing what's going on their farms. The typical settings for the model is we would have it set to deliver 270 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. We know that is probably quite a bit higher than a lot of our GrassCheckGB farmers are putting on. What isn't included in the model and the fertilizer aspect of it is the contribution from animal returns. So some data from AFB would estimate we could expect about 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year to be contributed to pastures from livestock. So in that sense, the model would be more representative of a figure about 230 kilograms. The other aspect that we don't have in the model at the moment isn't anything accounting for nitrogen fixation from clover or other legumes that are part of the sward. And that could be accounting for as much as 200 kilograms of nitrogen per year in swards that are containing high levels of clover. So it might sound like there's a lot of artificial nitrogen being put into the model, but not necessarily reflecting that farms contributing data are putting that much fertilizer onto their soils as well. In terms of the results we've had, the model outputs have been generated using the on-farm weather data that we've recorded, and we've averaged those weather figures per region. We've then compared them to the weekly farm grass growth rates for each region each week through the season. So the orange lines on these graphs are the model predicted figures, and the blue lines are the recorded figures that we had for 2021. In terms of looking at the accuracy of the model, I've been using a metric called root mean square error, which is not particularly exciting, but what it tells us, it gives us a figure of kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day, because that's the measurement unit we use for the grass growth. And over the whole of the season, so that March to October period, it gives us an average accuracy of the weekly grass growth model predictions. So the lower the value, the better the fit between the model and the data we've recorded. And the range of sort of average values over the past 3 years of data for each of the regions goes from 10 to 20 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per year. And if you take those figures and we compare them to the performance of other models that are in use sort of in Ireland and in other areas of the world, those figures are quite comparable, and we're quite happy that we've managed to achieve that level of consistency between the model and the data. So just on this slide are the figures for the other two regions, so south and north of England. And you can see on the previous slide and on this one that largely the model predictions do follow the trend of grass growth that's recorded on the farms. It's not perfect, we wouldn't expect it to be perfect. It's not, it's sort of would be quite challenging to develop a model that can be quite that accurate, because there's so many factors that you just can't account for within a model system compared to on the ground. But what we were doing in the test run last year, and what we envisage doing going forward, is using weather forecast data. So 7 and 14 day grass growth predictions can be generated from the model as well. So we'll have the actual weather data feeding in up to the current date and fill in the gaps with the forecast data for the next 2 weeks. That allows us to predict grass growth over that 2 week period. Just a couple of slides to show you where you can find more information, either on the project or some more localized grass data to look at sort of for your own interests and linked to your own farm. Data is available on the GrassCheckGB website. we're collating data weekly throughout the growing season, so not at the moment, but we'll be coming back with updates in from about March time. Those bulletins are published on social media and in the farming press. You can also access the live weather data and weekly updates to individual farm figures in terms of grass growth and quality in the weather tab on the website and on the map that's on the front page of the website as well. And on the website, we also have a number of farmer focus articles that feature GrassCheckGB farmers, links to previous webinar videos, and the video from today will be up there as well, and sort of regular news items and articles that get posted. So these are just a couple of screenshots from the website. On the right hand side here, there's an overview, and I apologise if we can't read the text on it, but this is the weather data coming from GrassCheckGB station in Rothamsted, so in Oakhampton in Devon. And it's giving live soil temperature and moisture values at the bottom of that table. So if you want to see sort of localised soil temperature conditions, now we're hopefully coming towards springtime, that's somewhere you can go to take a look at those. And that was everything from me.
Brilliant, thanks, Kat. Really comprehensive overview there of the project, and good to see so much data coming through. And I think for me, the big take home there was the ability of those farms that we're measuring to really mitigate some of those extreme weather conditions and still achieve really good output in what has been 3 very different years in terms of weather conditions and grass growth potential. Just a couple of quick questions. So just one from Mark that's come in, Kat. There seems to be, and this is to do with the grass quality results, there seems to be a dip in the crop protein percentage in the 2021 data in April and May. Was there any reason for that?
I think certainly in 2021 there was a lot less nitrogen applied to pastures when it was very, very dry in April. So it's going to be linked to sort of lower availability of nitrogen feeding into that at the time. Trying to find my figures. Yeah, and I think, yeah, so I think the dip again was around about the dry spell when grass growth had dipped as well in 2020. So it's just the variability.
Sorry, 2021.
Yeah, 2021, so it's around about, it's the same when we saw the peak with the quality in terms of metabolizable energy and sugar. So grass was sort of photosynthesizing very happily, but there wasn't a huge amount of nitrogen around, with people having to restrict fertilizer applications with it being so dry, and growth was a little bit stunted at that point. So I think that's what's just holding back the protein content there.
Okay, perfect. And just on the grass growth forecast, looking forward, I mean, at the minute we have sort of 7 and 14-day predictions of the grass growth forecast. Is there opportunities to forecast further ahead than that, or how confident would you be in providing more longer term forecasts with the model?
I think the confidence in the forecasts is more to do with the accuracy of the weather data that would be available to put into the model. So, you know, we've discussed internally doing much more long-term predictions with the model in terms of climate change forecasting for decades ahead, where you have daily time step data available. But in terms of the short-term forecasting and getting a really accurate figure that farmers can be using, at the moment you can only really get a 16-day weather forecast. And we do see, when we're using it in Northern Ireland and when I've been using it last year, that weather forecast can change week to week, and that changes the figures that come out of the model. So that's perhaps the biggest challenge in that sense.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Kat. I think at this stage we'll move on to our next speaker and the first of our farmer profiles, and that is Aled Evans, who farms in Carmarthenshire. Aled runs a 400-acre farm with
Debbie, I think we lost you. Okay, Debbie seems to have dropped out. Aled, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you, apologies, I don't have an introduction drafted for you, but do you want to share your screen and introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just share it now. It's coming very, very slowly, but I'll just start going through a little bit about what we do anyway. So I farm in partnership with my brother Ewan at Rest Farm in West Wales. We predominantly run a dairy beef enterprise with some low input outdoor lambing, flock of Romneys as well. And we've also set up a profit share agreement with Llevon Davis, who's an integral part of the team. My screen's very slow sharing, but we'll get there in a minute.
Do you want me to share mine, Aled?
Yeah, if you can, that'd be great.
Do that one. The joys of technical. There we go. Right, I'll mute myself and you can just shout when you want the next one.
There you go. So you can go on to the second slide already, Kat. So the system itself involves buying in calves from dairy farms, so they come on site about a fortnight age, and we put them into a climate controlled calf shed. So that then has a forced air system and ventilating curtains, just to give them the best possible start. Then if Kat takes us on to the next picture, the calves would go out to grass at about 65 kilos. We put them in groups of about 40 at this point, and they're having milk and concentrates up until weaning at about 80 kilos. And then in the next picture, we'll see that just basically going on to concentrates at grass. So they'd be on day shifts with grass and concentrates, and they're having concentrates up until they're at 120 kilos. So breeds, we're generally looking for breeds that are good at converting grass. So fair bit of favoritism at the minute for Angus, Herefords and stabilizers, just because we can get them converting grass and with the aim of getting them finished at grass as well. Then if you take us on to the next picture, Kat, something we've done a slightly different for this year with that group. Once they're off concentrates, we've been running them on a slightly longer grass leaf, so covers of up to about 3,000 kilos, for a few reasons really. One, it gives us a bigger plant area, a bit more of that solar panel for regrowth. We're taking more and more interest in soil health and rooting depth, and by not pressuring that plant all the time, we think we're getting a healthier root system. And with the young calves, you can see from the shine on them, they're doing over 1 kilo a day. Whereas before we've been running them on slightly more fiery, all ryegrass plants, and it was probably going through them and not doing what we wanted them to do at this point. So we seem to be getting better rumen health by running the system with the young calves. From this point then, we're into the next picture, we're putting them onto more diverse lays. So it's more of a red clover, white clover, plantain and a ryegrass mix. And we'd be achieving daily live weight gains of up to about 1.5 kilos just from pasture alone. That in turn also allows us to finish as much as possible from grass. So we'd be finishing at grass from probably the middle of June to middle of October, and it helps us put a low cost of production system in place. It also allows us to run a very, very low nitrogen system. So we're only using nitrogen as a supplement, as a tool if we need it, rather than routinely. So having these diverse lays has been a a major game changer with regards to that. And basically we're getting these cattle away between 20 to 24 months, looking to achieve a carcass of around 300 kilos. If we go into the next picture, Kat, please. So this is sort of how we've set it up to make the most, to grow our optimal amount of grass and to improve our efficiencies with regards to utilization. So we started out mapping a 12-hectare block with subdivision and putting trackways in place, and we could just see how much more grass we were growing, how we could cut nitrogen, and how our utilization went up. So having run that for one season, we then mapped all the farms just to put a system in place, and that's been a massive game changer for the system, really. It's allowed us to extend our days at grass, so we're only housing for targeting between 90 to 100 days. So they've already been out for 3 or 4 days this year, just because we've got infrastructure in place. It's reduced our most expensive period of the year with winter housing probably by 50 days from what we were doing 4 years ago. And then if you go on to the next picture, Kat, please. This is probably how we're doing it. We're using our infrastructure to go on off grazing at the shoulders of the season. So probably for the first fortnight of the season, they're going out for 3 hours a day, getting transitioned onto grass, getting grass as the biggest part of their ration, and then we're pulling them back off at 3 hours back into the sheds just to look after the soil more than anything. But getting them transitioned, used to utilizing that grass, used to hitting residuals early, means that the grass is already growing. So the next time we start measuring that in a fortnight, the growth on this block will be probably twice of what the area that hasn't been grazed as yet. So it's phenomenal in just getting the system going. And then if you go on to the next slide, please, Kat. This just shows, by putting them out for 3 hours, we're going out, utilizing grass very, very well. And it's surprising, after probably 2 or 3 days, they're achieving a really, really good utilization. And then in the next picture, you can see, just by minimizing the on time in that cell, so they're just there for 3 hours, they're utilizing it, going off. We're protecting soils at these, I guess, the most vulnerable times of the year as well. But it's a big cost saving for the system. And probably the added benefit, which we didn't really expect, is team morale goes through the roof when cattle are actually out, and we're not sitting on tractors all day, every day. In the next picture, so measuring's become a very, very important part of the system. So by being part of the GrassCheck project, getting into the routine habit of measuring weekly, taking fortnightly samples, I think the samples have given us confidence in the quality of grass that we have. So it's better than anything we can buy in the bag. And then by measuring, it allows us to make more informed decisions. So in the next slide, we can see a software called AgriNet. So we'd use AgriNet to look at a few things as a team. So we'd be looking at daily growth and demand, especially in sort of drought periods. Those figures are really important to us to make informed decisions, to be proactive rather than reactive. We're also looking at average farm cover, because that means how much grass we've got ahead, and it'll inform our decision making. And then graze days ahead is also quite a big one. So this time of year, we'd be looking to go at like a 50-day rotation, and then we'll shorten that rotation as we go into the sort of peak growing periods. And then in the next slide, we use a software called FarmMax. So this is more of a strategic software looking at a 12-month period. We'd be using this to plan 12 months ahead on stocking rates. If we take on a new block, we'll use it to decide on how we'd stock that block, inform decision making. If we go into periods of drought, it sort of allows us to look ahead a few months into the future to see what impact that'll have on our covers going into the autumn or spring. So it gives us more control from one season to the next. Next slide, please, Kat. This is a fairly typical lay of what we're now looking to achieve. So we're looking at a lot more diversity. We're looking at plantains just for bigger rooting depths, clover to fix nitrogen, and then some companions like ryegrass and timothy just to give us a bit more quantity, but then also with quantity as well. And then in the next slide, this is something that we're taking more and more interest in. Having developed our understanding of what's happening above ground, we want to know what's happening underneath it a lot more. So we're looking at infiltration rates, soil structure, rooting depths, and how our management of what we're doing on top of the grass is affecting the ground, and how we can take positive decisions going forward. In the next slide, we'll see a picture of rooting depths. So the diversity that we're now achieving, we're getting a lot more rooting depth and stronger roots than what we would have historically done just by running a ryegrass lay alone. So stuff like that going forward, I think we're going to take a hell of a lot more interest in. Then the next slide, the other really important, so that's some of the Welsh GrassCheck members, and being a part of GrassCheck and discussion groups has been vital to developing the business. So sharing knowledge with like-minded people, similar sorts of challenges, really, really great way of growing the business forward. And then finally, if anyone's bored and you want to have a look at what we're doing day to day, you can have a look at our Twitter and Instagram channels. It's great to engage with like-minded people on social media as well, just to see what the industry is doing to drive things forward. Thanks, Kat, for being the assistant.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for that, Aled, and apologies, a few technical issues there at the start. No, that's great to see what you're doing there, Aled. A few quick questions, if you don't mind. You talked about doing some on-off grazing at the minute. How are you managing your sort of supplementary feed to make sure those animals are sort of actively grazing when they get out there, and what sort of intakes are you asking of them at the minute off graze grass? Yeah,
so we're giving the cattle the ability to go ad lib at grass. So we'd be looking at 3% of body weight at grass. And in that 3 hours, they're getting that big fill. But what we're doing then is we're putting about a kilo of haylage when they're going back into the shed, basically to draw them back into the shed a little bit initially, because after about 5 or 6 days, they don't particularly want to come back into the shed. But then also in the morning, it means that they've finished that and they're hungry going out. So by being hungry going out, we're getting a better utilization than sending them out full, really.
Great. And some interesting stuff there on the soil side. Just on sort of your initial look at some of the paddocks and some of the fields, have you been surprised at what you found? Is there a lot of variation between paddocks? You know, when you've looked at soil structure, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's been drastic, to be honest. I think when we looked at the older ryegrass lays, there'd be some roots going down to maybe 10 centimeters, but they'd be few and far in between and fairly weak. And then we'd have some plantain lays which would have a strong tap root going down to that depth or even more. So yeah, that's been very, very interesting. Stuff like infiltration rates, maybe the best field would be running at 11 seconds. Some of the others would be more like 20, 30 minutes. So it's just sort of understanding what we're doing to cause that and going forward, sort of mitigating against that. Trying things like running a bit of a higher cover to see if we're getting better rooting depth in those. Moving to more of a min-till cultivation process, all that sort of thing. So we're at the beginning of the journey, probably one or 2 years into it, but yeah, it's very, very interesting, I guess, especially with nitrogen and stuff at the moment, looking at rhizomes and the ability of our clover plants to fix that nitrogen. Not just assuming because there's clover there, it's going to be doing a good job of it. So there's, yeah, we've got a lot more to learn about that, but it's quite exciting going forward, I think.
Brilliant. And a question that's just come in: do you get any problems with hungry stock on clover rich lays, or are they well adapted?
I think we're probably very, very adaptive. So if we see a period of heavy rainfall, I probably wouldn't put them onto a very, very high red clover lay. So we'd probably pick and choose a little bit at times of years, because when the dry matter stops, they probably will go through it a bit quicker. So it's just having the adaptation of, there's different techniques we'll use during the year to different things. So whether it's wet periods or drought periods, we might bring in additional areas into rotations to extend it, or we might put a bit of haylage across fence lines. So it's just making informed decisions, really.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for that overview. And at this stage, we'll maybe move on to our next presentation, and that our next presenter is Dr. Francis Lively, who is a beef scientist here at AFBI. He's been doing some work on grass minerals from some of the GrassCheck farms. So hopefully at this stage, I'll pass over to Francis if he's there to share his screen and tell us a little bit about that piece of work.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. I'm just trying to share my screen here.
Thanks, Francis.
And hopefully that is something sure.
Coming up now, hopefully.
It's slightly slow, but
no, that's us now. That's great. Thanks, Francis.
My food doesn't start, so apologies you can see at the moment, but has the presentation shared yet?
Yes, it's up now, Francis.
So as we're waiting on the press share, I'll maybe start. Right, it's still not up on my screen. I'll just keep going away. So just as a background to start, last year during the grazing season of 2021, we worked aligned with other GrassCheck farmers who take a survey just to get a handle on grass content or the macronutrient content of grass throughout the grazing season. In terms of this study was funded by DERA and DERA in Northern Ireland, and really the background to the study was a lot of farmers reporting trace elements deficiencies within their livestock, both cattle, dairy cattle, beef and sheep. And it's really interesting. We're therefore interested just to see what's causing this here. Is it something from the cattle side? Is it something from the plant? Is it from the soil? Or even how does just the soil levels move to the plant levels, and plant levels move to the animal level? So we first of all undertook a literature review, and basically from that literature review we identified there was actually very little work had been done in recent years on these interactions between the plant, between the soil, the plant and the animal. So then we've reviewed a number of existing databases within AFBI, and currently we're pulling together some of the health information just to see what is the level at farm level across Northern Ireland, and how has that changed over the last 10 years. So we're currently pulling some of our veterinary information together on that from our colleagues in Veterinary Science Division. Then what I want to talk about today is really the survey that we took, and really that was just to get a handle on the plant level at the trace element component within the plants, you know, from some of our GrassCheck farms. So Origin Fertilizers kindly covered the cost for analysing a number of GrassCheck samples last year. So we've already heard from Kat this morning and from some of the farmers in terms of how they sample the grass each fortnight, and essentially that grass sample, a duplicate was taken and that was sent to the lab for analysis of a number of trace elements. So in terms of the farms, last year we had over 40 farms submitted samples, a mixture of beef, dairy and sheep. For the purpose of today, I've of combined the beef and farms together, as a lot of beef farms also had sheep, and likewise sheep farms had beef cattle. And I say the majority was from Northern Ireland, but there was a few from Scotland, England, and Wales as well. So just taking a quick look at some of the results in terms of the results. Basically, first of all, looking at some of the nutrients. So if we look first of all, and hopefully you can see this okay into this. So if we look at nitrogen first, so we've got the guideline here, guideline fixed down along this column, and the average results. This is the average of about 260 samples taken throughout 2021. You see that. Although the average was too different from the guideline in terms of guideline content of these within the grass, there was fairly high. Always is categorized into whether they were classified as being low, normal, or high. Obviously, if the nitrogen was majority of nitrogen was null. Was 50%, the phosphorus in the samples low. Calcium percent of were low in calcium, and 60% low in magnesium. And obviously these would have implications for animal health and animal. So it is important to consider these going forward. Sulfur on the other high, there's actually sulfur on the other hand. There was about 40% of the samples were high for sulfur. Moving on now to the next batch of results, and this is looking at boron, copper, and manganese in this series. And again, a high proportion of the samples were low. Again, the average result mightn't mean too far off, but certainly a high proportion of farms of the grass samples were low for this. And then if we look at some of the other trace elements in which are particularly important for health and reproduction, zinc, cobalt, selenium, and sodium, and you can see certainly very, very high levels here of samples in the low category. Excuse me. So just to present it graphically, and we'll just take a few of these to look at. And if we look at the impact of farm type and season on grass phosphorus content, we can see sort of the orange dots are the beef and sheep combined, and the black dots are those from the dairy. And throughout the season, there's not much difference. So the red line is sort of the guideline where we should be aiming to be. But you can see certainly, although it's the guideline, there's only about half of the half of the samples are above the guideline and half of them are below it. But very little difference across the beef, sheep, or dairy farms. In terms of trends throughout the year, there was a small, not a huge difference, but there was a small increase as the season progressed with the phosphorus content in the grass. Again, I'll not go through a lot of these, but we'll just pull out a few that were particularly low, or a lot of farms in the low category, or grass samples in the low category. So again, magnesium, again, very little difference across the beef and sheep, following a very similar trend, but certainly more of a seasonal variation with higher levels coming in the autumn than there was during the summer. In terms of copper, overall a very high level of the grasses were low on copper. No difference really between the beef or sheep, but again a tendency there for the levels to increase towards the autumn relative to the spring. In terms of zinc, again, quite low levels in the majority of cases, one or two sort of outliers with very high levels, but the majority of cases we were below the recommended level and classified as low, but very little difference across beef and sheep, and very little difference throughout the season in terms of the content. I think the final one I've presented here, not to bore you with lots of grass, but really was the selenium content. And overall, the majority of grasses were low in selenium, but and certainly very little difference across the beef or sheep. However, there was the odd farm that slightly higher levels, and there's certainly towards the autumn had much higher levels than the spring. So we're still trying to identify the reasoning behind this. In terms of the samples selected, these grass samples were selected just as basically being representative to the grass that the cattle or sheep were about to eat, and we therefore would expect that this would obviously have some impact to the trace elements within the animal throughout the grazing season, and therefore it is quite important to look at this going forward from an animal perspective. So just to summarise the results to date, this first initial look at this data, survey data, would indicate that there are deficiencies at a farm level in terms of the grassland and the content. And these low levels may have some implications for both plant performance and also for livestock performance. Particularly, some of them would be more inclined to be linked with reproductive performances in addition to growth as well. So they are important. The main ones to look at, I've mentioned there: phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, boron, copper, manganese, zinc, cobalt, selenium, and sodium. Overall, the results seem to be quite similar across farm types, so it doesn't matter whether it's a beef farm, a sheep farm, or a dairy farm. There does seem to be an issue there, and there does seem to be some changes throughout the season. Some of the trace elements or some of the elements we've looked at are low right throughout the season. Others do seem to increase. Content does seem to increase towards the autumn, but overall, you can see from the earlier graph, not huge differences. But really, we've just collected this information, and we do need to take more further analysis on it, just to determine what the farm differences are. Is there location differences? Is there soil type? What's the management? And particularly, is there farms, some of those high levels towards the autumn? Was there a reason behind that? Was there a change in management? Was there a change in grass type? Was the grass possibly from a multi-species sward relative to a perennial ryegrass sward? So we've still some analysis to do on that we're currently working on. But that's a very brief run through some of that initial data. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions about
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Francis, for that. So actually some quite surprising results there in terms of the number of samples that I suppose were deficient in some of the nutrients. I suppose just a quick question. Obviously, we've had quite a variable season last year. How much do you think weather conditions, for example, the drought that we had, would have impacted on nutrient content within the swards? Sorry, Francis,
just in terms of the drought, Debbie, last year we sorry, yeah, can you hear it?
Yep, thanks.
So last season we obviously did with this here from farms, and there was some indication that there was drought, but equally we had a similar study, a PhD study in 2019, when there was also a drought, and certainly in that case we found that following the drought, there was like a surge of growth, and at that stage we saw actually some of the trace element levels started to decline. In that particular study, we also had 4 fertilizer levels, with grass getting 0, 90, 180 or 270 kilograms of nitrogen. And in some cases, we saw as the nitrogen level increased, so did the content of the trace elements decreased in some indications. But it's hard to know whether that was the interaction with the nitrogen, or whether it was the fact that the soil was working harder and the plant was working harder and actually not able to take as much from the soil. So we're still trying to work through those that information, Debbie, just to see, is there an interaction between what happens in the soil and the plant in that. But we have also analysed that particular batch of data to look at the impact, or look at the comparison with nutritional quality, i.e. the things we'd normally look at in terms of the protein and the energy. And at this stage, we're not seeing a huge huge amount of evidence coming through, but that's something we hope to combine that data set with this data set, and we'll have close to 500 samples then, and it'll be a more robust scientific comparison. So we're working at that at the moment, but certainly I think this has been one of the first studies, and it's really more of a survey than a detailed scientific study. So it's really just scratching the surface. This is an area that there hasn't been much research done. Most of the published research is 60, 70 years old. So it's been quite a while from this has been looked at.
Yeah, definitely good to see some figures coming through on it. Francis, quick question coming in here. Do you have any guidelines then on how to correct these deficiencies?
In terms of guidelines on how to correct them, not at this stage, but certainly we've got to see what that interaction is in terms of how to correct them. There could be options that supplements could be added to the fertilizer, but what we need to actually see is if we do that if we correct the soil, will that correct the plant, and will that correct the animal? I suppose at this stage, from an animal nutrition perspective, it's probably wiser to correct it at an animal level in terms of supplementing the animal, whether it's through boluses, through drenches, or through supplements in the water. That's probably where the guidelines would be at this stage. But longer term, we have to see, can we actually correct it through, say, a supplement, or through an addition to the fertilizer, instead of just your can you add something to the nitrogen? There are some products out there, and certainly there's some there's a little bit of evidence, albeit the majority of it is commercial evidence, to suggest that it does increase levels, but we need to look at that in more detail.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Francis. I think lots of questions, so and good to see that data coming through. I think now we'll stick in on the theme of minerals and trace elements, and certainly that link between the soil and the grass. And our next speaker on the program is Taro Tanashaki, who is joining us from Rothamsted Research. He's an agricultural economist there, and he is going to present some of the results of some work that the team at Rothamsted have been doing on soils on some of the GrassCheck farms. So Taro, I'll pass over to you, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Debbie. So what we are doing is slightly different from what Francis is trying to achieve, in the sense that he and the API team is looking at the micronutrient in grass, and obviously that's the most important thing, because ultimately what matters is the animal performance. But we are looking at the slightly before in the time and the nutrient flow, whereby the micronutrients are transferred from soil to the grass. And I'd like to just talk very briefly about what we are doing here. We haven't analyzed the complete soil samples from the GrassCheck farms yet. We just finished our sampling just before Christmas. We visited the final set of Scottish farms in December. So we will just give you the brief update here, and hopefully in the future occasions we can talk more about the guidelines and the others that Francis and Debbie were discussing earlier as well. So we try to get the GrassCheck network both for GB and NI. And we got the 67 participants across the two groups. And the one of the research questions we have got is that within a single farm, and how would the mineral transfer differ between the best paddocks and the worst paddocks, or best fields and worst paddocks? So what we did was to go back to the GrassCheck data of the plate metering from 2020 and 2019 to identify the best and worst paddocks for each of the 67 farms. Based on those data, we collected the grass samples and soil samples both from these paddocks, And for grass, we asked the farmers to send us the samples 5 times a year from May to September. And once the samples arrive at the lab, we check the species composition manually, so that we know, roughly speaking, what kind of species are there, what percentage is occupied by legumes and so on. And then at the end of the season, we had the field tour, or the road trip, if you like, and to collect all the soil samples and 2 paddocks per farm, so that we could analyze the relationship between the soil data and the grass data here. So the main question ultimately is that what kind of soil deficiencies are affecting the pasture growth most? And of course, we want to then ultimately link that to the animal performance later. But I think we will stick to this grass soil grass nexus first, so that we can analyze the fertilization strategies and also potentially the optimal or improve the grazing patterns to slow down the pace of the extraction of the micronutrient. We have got the sampling sites spread across the whole country. We have got the 57 farms that completed more than 3 grass samplings. So all the data that we are going to show and also to be analyzed will be based on those farms, because otherwise probably the uncertainty of the measurement, the cost of uncertainty outweighs the benefit of including them, because the soil pasture transfer can be quite a random process as well. So we analyze the total elements for the grass samples plus nitrogen, and the most major micronutrients here included, and they are all complete now. And for soil, we have got the sample now being processed in the lab, and we analyzed all the available micronutrients and from the corresponding elements, but also we are trying to identify the level of soil organic carbon and inorganic carbon, also available phosphorus and the cation, and that potentially regulating the transfer from soil to the grass. We are now in the process of collecting farming systems and topography of these 2 farms. The topographies are quite important because of the water movement there, and that may be regulating the transfer as well, especially during the wet time of the year. I'd like to just show a couple of preliminary results that may be of interest. So we have been comparing the micronutrient content of the best paddocks and green paddocks, as we call them, or there was paddocks and black paddocks, as we call them. And for the 6 elements so far, we have identified a very significant difference between them across the whole farm and also across the 5 times of the year. So what it may suggest is that these elements are driving the performance, not of 2021, because the separation between the best and worst paddocks were done based on 2020-2019 data. And so how quickly that definition changes, we are not sure yet. But and there is some difference here, and that is what we are going to analyze most to identify basically what minerals we should focus on, practically speaking. My last slide shows the change in the micromineral content across the time of the year. Again, this is the average values across all of the sample farms, but then there are others that are interesting for particular farm, which we will write reports soon. Basically, what it is showing here, especially for those in red, including the aluminum on the leftmost column, is that the some of the elements, their contents are basically decreasing monotonically across the whole season, meaning that there is a chance that the annual performance are getting affected towards the later in the season for those because of the deficiency of these elements. And we would like to now know whether this is because of the deficiency in these elements in the soil, or whether it's got some other driving factors there. And also we'd like to know whether this process is ongoing, meaning that we are extracting so much of these minerals at the pace much faster than the replenishment. In that case, and we will have some critical point, or the tipping point under which we cannot produce grass well. For that, we are hoping to match these data against our park grass experiment at Rosenstedt, which started in 1856. So and Debbie and I and Francis were discussing the potential impact of last year's somewhat special weather patterns, and we are trying to account for that by analyzing the historic changes in the micromineral contents, because we have got the data from all past years, 178 years of the grass samples. So we are analyzing some of them to see how these changes are being observed. So ultimately, and once we complete this analysis across the time series and also across the between the good paddocks and bad paddocks, the question being investigated here is that can we slow down this decrease by altering the grazing patterns? We have got the weak evidence at the Northwick Farm platform, and this is not confirmed yet, but some micromineral deficiencies may be actually less common on paddocks or fields whereby we put more sheep rather than cattle. And our working hypothesis right now is that's because the spreading of the manure would be more uniform there, because we have got more of them across the paddock. Whereas for cattle, we have got fewer of them, although each deposition is of higher content. So we are looking into this and see if you are a mixed species farm, how you could put animals in what order to slow down this process of the decline of the micronutrients. But and that's still a work in progress. So and there, I think a lot of interesting things that could potentially come up from it. So I think we need maybe a few months, or maybe 5-6 months to analyze all the soil data and report back to you, Debbie. Thank you so much today.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Taro. So a lot of figures definitely coming through there on that. I suppose just a sort of wee point of clarification on where the elements, we found that there was certain elements that were decreasing through the season. Was that more notable on the poorer pastures than on the good performing pastures?
We're trying to analyze that pattern, but at the first look of the data set, I think that is more common amongst the bad pastures. So, but and the reason behind it, we're not 100% sure. This is still very anecdotal.
Okay, and what impact do you think does soil structure, because I know you're taking some soil structure measurements as well, what impact does that have, or do you think that has on some of the element transfer to the plant?
So on the when the physical soil structure is different, then obviously you have got the different movement of the nutrition there from the pore space. And what we don't know yet is whether these good paddocks, 67 good paddocks and 67 bad paddocks, whether there is any difference in soil structure there. Basically, we know that the good structure will improve the grass performance. What we don't know is that the quantitatively how important it is compared to other driving factors. So we would like to identify whether that is driving the all results more, or nutrients, or topography, and so on. We are working on that.
Okay, brilliant. Well, hopefully some really interesting stuff there to come. Thanks very much for that, Taro.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. So our next speaker today is our second of our farm profiles, and I'd like to invite Robert Drummond to talk to us this morning. Robert farms up in Ayrshire in Scotland, and runs about 170-acre dairy farm there, and hopefully he'll be able to give us a bit of an overview of his farm and how he uses grass within the business. Over to you, Robert.
Right, hi, thank you, good morning. Hope you can all hear me okay. I am going to rely on Kat moving the slides on again, so if you just want to move on to the next slide. The farm here at Osley Bray with myself and my wife, obviously a small unit. If you just want to move on, Kat, please. We're 55 organic Ayrshire's, predominantly Ayrshire and Ayrshire crosses. We're all on one block of land. It's about 80 hectares altogether, owning 72, and an additional 8 hectares that is rented in. If you can make out on that rather not the scale map that's on my dairy wall for the relief milker, the 4 fields on the left hand side of the 8 hectare rented block, and the rest of the farm you can see is all in one block, which makes management a lot easier. A wee bit of history. The farm was bought in 2013. Historically had been a beef and sheep unit, and then for 10 years was let seasonally for around 10 years, best of our knowledge. Meant soil fertility, fences and that kind of thing were maybe a bit run down. So we've been slowly improving those kind of things infrastructure wise as we go on year from year. We're about 10 miles south of Glasgow, and the aspect of the farm is predominantly west and east facing. The kind of top half of that map is the west facing. We start at 350 feet above sea level on that westerly boundary, rising to just under the 500 feet and about the centre of the farm, and then the east aspect drops down to about 400 feet above sea level. So that's kind of the geography of the farm. Of that 80 odd hectares, we try to reseed about 3 or 4 hectares a year. We've switched from a full reseed to overseeding, partly through the organic wanting to cut down, less ploughing. Also, we feel that overseeding allows us to bring that pasture back into the grazing cycle a bit quicker. And just a point of note of 2017, we added in over 1 kilometre of tracks. The original farm track is that track that runs kind of top to bottom of that map. The new tracks are all the east to west spurs. Now you think I only go to that next slide. I was there anyway. Well, we're converted to organic in 2017. Primarily, it was an economic decision initially. The problem was we just bought the farm. We were running a conventional system with the aim to expand to about 110 milking herd. The economic downturn in the conventional market at the time was under a fair bit of financial stress. So we were looking at changes that we could make, and by converting to organic, it opened up a wee bit more grant funding. It increased our milk price once the conversion period was finished. At the time, it more or less doubled our milk price, which allowed us to increase that overall income without actually making major changes to the farm. If we continued with the original plan to increase the stocking rate, it would have meant a fairly hefty investment in buildings and slurry storage. The farm could accommodate 60 roughly milking cows and followers without too much spent in infrastructure. And because we were lightly stocked, we felt we could anticipate the expected production on a purely organic system. We could sustain the livestock we had. And on the right hand side of that slide, sorry, excuse me, it just gives you a bit of history about what our production's been. I just picked the odd years because last year was at 21. You can see in 2015 when artificial fertilizer was cut out, we dropped down to about 6.5 tonnes a hectare. Prior to that, the previous year was about 7.5, 8 tonnes, and then it dipped a bit more than 2017 as we completed the conversion. The full Clover benefit hadn't started to kick in. At that stage, we had overseeded some Clover in the 2 conversion years of organic, but we weren't getting the benefit out of it yet. But as you can see in the more recent years, we're back up over 9 tonnes, which is probably exceeding our expectations given we're on the organic system. So we're actually very satisfied with that level of grass production given the system we're on. So if you want to move on, Kat, again, please. This is just a screenshot from the AgriNet software that we use as well. You can see the total production for each field, and the red line is the average. The yellow bars are fields that have been utilised for silage at some point through the year. Generally speaking, we take about it's usually a 2 or 3 cut system depending on the season. There's a run of 4 low bars, kind of 25 through to 28. That is the rented hectares. 29 is a small outlying block of 3 hectares that we don't usually bother measuring too accurately, so it didn't include the figures because it wouldn't have been that accurate. But that graph, I like to look at that graph sometimes to remind me of what my worst fields maybe should be achieving in comparison to some of our best fields. So that's always the target. If we can bring some of those poorer performing fields up close to that red line, would be doing very well, I think. If you want to move on again, Kat, please. So current management system, the biggest pressure we're under year from year is to meet the winter fodder demands. And that has led us to continue to practice the extended grazing. A fair bit of experience of using that as a way of extending the grazing season is already been mentioned. It's good for the soul to see cows out on pasture rather than kept in sheds and having to feed them with a tractor every day. So key to this is the gates and the tracks that we installed. It makes moving the herd about far simpler. Gateways are used very infrequently because most segments have at least 2 or 3 gates in and out. Cows can enter one gate and come out a different gate, so we're reducing pressure, poaching out gateways totally. It makes it an absolute dream to operate. Our rotation length at turnout will be about 120 days. Basically, take our 80 hectares, divide it by 120, gives us about 2/3 of a hectare per day. So that's where we start and calculate the cow's requirements of what's on that cover. We have to be very selective in this part of the country where we are, what fields and what parts of fields that we can graze, just given ground conditions. But I'm rarely stuck for a day that I can't find about 2/3 of a hectare to put cows out on for 2 or 3 years. And then just at the bottom of that, there's indications of the very low stocking rate that we work on, which is allows us to achieve that extended grazing system as well. So if you want to move on again, Kat, please. And that's just a quick example of one of the tracks that we put in. It's a one dust cover over type 1 stone, and there's an Ecotex membrane to stop the weeds coming through. We do get a wee bit of grass, certainly in the less frequently used parts of the track coming over the top, but a bit of cow traffic over that helps. And you see on the right hand side of the track there's a electric fence. More or less every field of paddock has serviced with electric fence and at least one boundary, therefore making the splitting and subdivision far easier. And to improve the water infrastructure, basically converted IBCs into water troughs, so that every 5 hectares has at least one water point. So that makes management far easier and far more flexible. If you want to go on again, Kat. The keys to extended grazing in the west central Scotland, flexibility. If there's a weather window there, we take it. I don't worry what the calendar says. If it's the sun shining and ground conditions match, we'll go. We've got paddocks very regular during that, at least a couple of times a week, especially in the shoulders of the season. And I've kind of a fairly philosophical way to grazing that if I can graze cows for a week in February, that's me saving a week's worth of silage that I might need come April or May. I'm sure some of you in Devon are laughing at snow in May, but it does happen up here, unfortunately. So we'll have to keep that in mind. The way we encourage the cows to eat is they go out with an appetite. We're happy to have the trough empty for 2 or 3 hours pre-milking, The cows are milked, and as they exit the parlour, they go straight to the field. So we're not releasing the whole herd in one group. Our modest sized parlour for a modest sized herd, they're only going out in size of 7. So you're only having 7 cows walking through a gate at a time. It's 10-minute or so intervals, rather than the whole herd marching out through and maybe tramping the gate. Each cow's got time to choose her footing and walks out very, very calmly, and it usually works all right. Even if there's a bit of rain coming down, they know they're getting a fresh bite every day, so they're happy to march on out and get that fresh bite of grass. We're working the basis that if I can provide 3 hours twice a day, that's providing around 80% of their demand, which is also a massive saving in winter feed demand. So if you want to move on to the next slide again, please. And to make up the balance of that 80%, with still getting silage and meal in the shed, we feed meal flat rate when they return to the shed. We'll try to avoid feeding filling up the shed with silage when the cows are close to that 3 hour time, because as soon as they hear an engine, that's when they'll make for the gate. So we fill the troughs up as soon as they're at the shed. That way the cows they're not distracted with the sound of an engine. They think, oh, there's a bit of silage going in. Keeps them concentrating in grazing. If the weather and grass supply allows us, we will move them into the next 3 hour block quite quickly. They won't necessarily come straight back to the shed, because obviously keeping them very close eye in the forecast. If there's heavy rain forecast for that evening, we don't put them out after the evening milking. They'll get their second 3 hour block at some stage through the day, maybe around lunchtime or whatever. So it's purely built around flexibility. I can't emphasise enough how flexible we are in our grazing. And just going on, we start with quite low covers, and we feel this helps train the cow to eat down to that target of 1500. I think especially in the shoulders of the season, if they go into higher covers, it's quite hard to get them to eat down to that level, because they're not used to it, they're not trained to do it, and there's also if they're walking through longer grass, you can contaminate it before they've actually ate it down. And we've learned, because of our very long rotation in the shoulders of the season, that if we do damage or poaching, it could be 100 days before you're back in that field. The recovery is unbelievable. Until you actually experience it, you can't really believe it. So we're working that principle as well. And yes, sometimes we get it wrong, and sometimes the cows are maybe only out for an hour and the weather changes quickly. You turn around, you bring them back in, you don't worry about it. So if you want to move on again, Kat, please. That's just an example of some of our grazing land. That is some of the steeper ground, to be fair. It's not all like that, thankfully. You can see in the foreground the previous box grazing, what we're eating down to. So thank you. I hope that was informative for at least some of you. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Robert. Yeah, some of the figures at the start really surprised me. 1500 millimeters of rainfall, and you're at fairly high altitude as well. 300 plus feet above sea level, so definitely not an easy farm to manage. I suppose, sort of quick question, you mentioned overseeding at the start, and you've obviously moved away from ploughing. How easy do you find that to do? And what are the tricks, I suppose, to make it work?
I'm still learning is the honest answer. We're grazing down. We try and time our overseeding to probably May time, when soil temperatures are hopefully on the rise, are still rising, and there's a good background temperature there by that stage as well. Fields that would be hard grazed, maybe even got a few sheep here as well. There's 20 black-faced yow hogs that we've got. I would maybe turn them into it after the cows have grazed it down to get it right rumped down, and it's usually 2 or 3 harrows, and then just broadcast and then harrowed again. We keep it very simple. I'll be honest, we don't usually see the benefit of it that first season. It will be the following season before you see, because we've done it in the past and we've thought, well, that's been a waste of time in there. And then the following season, you've got an extra ton and a half of grass in that same paddock. it's being organic. There is a bit of a waiting game. You do need to wait on not just the spring temperatures to get the clover going to start fixing the nitrogen, but reseeds as well. It really shows that you need a bit of patience as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose, I mean, you really emphasize there the flexibility that you need within the system and the importance of the infrastructure. How to do that as well? I mean, how much would you be looking at grass data and getting out and measuring the paddocks? Do you find there are certain times of the year that's more valuable than others? Or
yes, there are calculations getting done every day because we're setting the area rather than the grass cover, especially those very early long rotations. It really is if the cows are only getting 5 kilograms, then we have to make up the gap, and that 5 kilograms in the 3 hours. Then we're adding in that's the difference. The other 10 or 12 kilograms has to come from somewhere. So is that silage? Is there going to be a weather opportunity that day to go for another 3 hours to get another 5 kilos? It's always a calculation that some days we achieve 10 or 12 kilos of grass, some days it's just 6. So you're obviously balancing and making up the difference every day. So it is a ongoing arithmetic.
Definitely, you need a good head for numbers anyway. And then just you showed some data at the start from sort of grass growth on the farm throughout sort of the last sort of 6-7 years. So how long have you been measuring grass yourself, and sort of what got you into it?
Well, we came on to this farm in November 2013, but I've been measuring grass for about, I worked in Ireland for 4 years, so I was measuring grass there, the farm I was on, and the rented farm in Scotland prior to that, and I was measuring there, so nearly 20 years now. I don't really want to count it up.
Brilliant, but obviously an important component of what you're doing day to day at the minute.
Very much so, very much so.
Brilliant.
It's the cheapest feed, so we want to be using it as efficiently as possible. And being an organic system and our geography, you have to be, to make best use of it, I think you have to be calculating it as best you can.
Definitely. Oh, brilliant. Here, thanks very much for that, Robert. Much appreciated. Good to get an overview of another one of the farms in the GrassCheck project. So so we've got a couple more people that's just going to join us this morning for before we finish up for the morning session. Thank you everybody for staying with us for the duration of the session. But the next person that I wanted to introduce was Helen Matthew from Drummond. Back over the summer, we've been running, GrassCheckGB has been running a photo competition, and Helen and Germinal have kindly sponsored that photo competition. So what we were asking people to do was send us in their best grass photo, or upload it to Twitter and tag the GrassCheckGB Twitter account in that, and those then photos have been judged. So I'll pass over to Helen to hopefully announce the winner of the competition.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Can you hear me?
Yes, can do.
Would you like me to share the picture?
If you can, that would be fantastic.
Let's try. Hang on. I don't know whether that's worked. Hang on. How's that?
Brilliant. Yeah, that's it.
You can see it? Okay, yep. So just to say that there were some excellent photographs, and clearly there's some very skillful photographers amongst you farmers. There were some beautiful skies, lovely sunrises, not sunsets, and some very fit looking cows and some super grazing platforms. The reason I chose the plate meter really was, well, you can see there in the foreground there's a good looking lay, and in the distance a patchwork of well managed grassland. So why the plate meter? Well, I think Robert just emphasised it now. You know, if we're not measuring it, it's the cheapest feed that we've got, and we've got to know how much we've got, and we've got to be managing it. And that was also how the day started, with Robert Hassell telling us about, you know, the importance of measuring. So to me, that was the most sort of poignant picture really that sort of suited GrassCheck. So it's and the photographer is Phil Hughes, who I'm sure we'll be in touch with him, or he'll be in touch with us, and we'll make sure that, I think there's 5 acres of grass seed going over, Debbie, that we put up for the sponsorship. So well done, and thank you everybody for taking part.
Brilliant. And I don't know if we've got Emma on the call or Emma on here today. Emma, maybe it'd be possible to get some of these photos up on the GrassCheck website, because there was some really good entries that have come through.
Yes, definitely.
Brilliant. No, that's great. And thanks very much to Germinal and Helen for sponsoring that. So just to finish up then, before we break for lunch and return to the afternoon session later on, Emma Lumley, who is with CL, she's going to give us a bit of an overview. Is helping coordinate the project, and she's going to give us an overview of what the GrassCheck plans are for 2022 onwards. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. Thanks, Debbie. I'll just share my. Can you see this?
Yep, we've got it now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Emma Lumley. I'm from CL, which is one of the 4 UK Agri-Tech centres. And I'd just like to give an update on the project extension, which some of you may have heard about. But I'd like to start by saying thank you to everyone who's been involved with the project so far. It's been a great 3 years with such an enthusiastic team, and it's been a really valuable project. So I'd like to say thank you to the project farmers and everyone who's been involved with capturing data on farm, as well as our industry sponsors, Germinal, Handley Enterprises, Waitrose and Partners, Datamars Livestock and Cyantech, as well as the 3 UK meat levy boards, AHDB, Beef and Lamb, QMS and HCC, and our academic partners, AFB and Rothamsted Research, and finally Innovate UK. So Kat mentioned it earlier, but throughout the project, there's been a lot of webinars and useful articles produced, which you can go and view at any time on the GrassCheckGB website. So in terms of the project extension, it's great that this has been confirmed for a minimum of 2 years. So we'll be expanding on the current work, so that will continue, but we'll also be adding additional studies focusing on evaluating the impact of different rotational grazing management strategies on animal performance and grass utilization. We'll be examining blanketed and targeted fertilizer regimes in rotational grazing systems. And finally, we'll be assessing the value of clover on commercial farms. And more information about these will come out through the season, so you can keep up to date with how they're progressing. And I'd also like to thank Corteva and Morrison's, as they'll be joining the project for this extension. So that's all from us this morning. So thank you to all our speakers and everyone who's joined for your time. I will be back again this afternoon at 2 o'clock. If you haven't registered already, you still can do that via our website. But if you can't join us, the session will be recorded, so you can watch it when you're free later on. And that session this afternoon will be joined by some scientists who will be updating us on grassland research. Thank you. Thanks. That's all from me.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Emma. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll just echo Emma's thanks to everybody that's joined this morning, and to all of our project sponsors and partners that we've been working with over the past 3 years. It has been really good to see everybody come together on this project, which has provided hopefully some really useful data for the industry over the last couple of years, and will do going forward as well. So yep, as Emma said, we're starting again at 2 o'clock. So hopefully see all of you back then later on. Enjoy your lunch. Thanks very much.